Good afternoon. Very happy to welcome you to this lecture in the series featuring illuminating discussions surrounding the special exhibition now in the Sackler, Gods of Angkor, Bronzes from the National Museum of Cambodia. I'm Louise Court, curator for ceramics at the Freer in Sackler, and was co-curator of the exhibition along with my colleague Paul Jett, who's head of the Department of Conservation and Scientific Research. We look forward very much to presenting to you a series of talks on Saturday afternoons through the fall that will illuminate aspects of the exhibition as well as related topics. And we're very pleased in particular that we can begin by presenting talks by 3 of the 4 authors of the catalog for the exhibition. The catalog for the exhibition is on sale in our bookstore, and it will be on sale in the table outside the auditorium if you wish to have today's speaker sign it for you. There will be 9 lectures altogether in this series, as well as performances, film, and music programs. You can keep track of these through the calendar and through the online information on our website. And if you wish and are not already signed up for email announcements, you're welcome to do that as well. There's information in the calendar on how to do that. I'm very happy to present today the talk by one of the catalog authors. In fact, the catalog author who made possible, by his willingness to write for the catalog, a very important aspect of the exhibition. The part of the exhibition that shows bronze objects not nearly so familiar to American audiences as sculpture, the so-called ritual paraphernalia, and other bronze materials that were very important within the Angkorian world and yet are much less well known. And our speaker today, John Guy, kindly tackled that topic, a topic that has been of deep interest to him for some time, wrote about it for the catalog, and will tell us more about it today. John, after many years at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, is now, fortunately for us, curator of South and Southeast Asian art at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So he's just up the road and can come and visit often. And John is also an elected fellow of the Society of Antiquaries in London. His research focuses on Indian temple arts and India's cultural relations with Southeast Asia in the fields of sculpture, ceramics, and textiles. He's worked on a number of archaeological excavations at both land and maritime sites, and has served as an advisor to UNESCO on historical sites in Southeast Asia. He has curated and co-curated a number of exhibitions, including The Peaceful Liberators, Giant Art from India, 1995, Temple Sculpture, Indian Temple Sculpture, The Art of Devotion, Barcelona, 2007, Buddhist Manuscript Painting, The Palm Leaf Tradition, New York, 2008, and he has contributed to many others. Most recently, Encounters, the Meeting of East and West at the Victoria and Albert, The Sculpture of Champa, Paris, Musée Guimet, 2005-06, and Vietnamese Art in Singapore, 2008. And of course, we're very honored that he contributed to the catalog for Gods of Angkor. John has also curated and co-curated a number of exhibitions and published many articles and catalogs and separately standing books in connection with them. I'd like to mention in particular that his book, Woven Cargoes, Indian Textiles in the East, which was originally published in 1998, was recently reissued by popular demand in paperback in 2009 and is available under the title Indian Textiles in the East. John is going to speak today on the aspect of the exhibition that he dealt with in the catalog essay. His title, as you can see, is Golden Towers, Reconstructing the Lost Ornamentation of Angkor. And when the talk is finished, rather than taking questions here, those of you who have questions and would like to speak with John directly are invited to come to the exhibition, and we'll walk through the exhibition and answer questions in the context of the objects that he will have introduced us to in more depth. And if you want him to sign a copy of the catalog, he can also do that at that time. So I'd like to welcome John Guy.
Thank you, Louise, and welcome everybody. I'd just like to begin by thanking Louise Court and Paul Jett, and indeed Director Julian Raby for the invitation both to speak here today, but also to contribute in a small way to this exhibition, and to congratulate the Free Sackler on this initiative, both for the very important contribution this museum has made together with the Getty in establishing an all-important metals conservation laboratory at the National Museum in Phnom Penh, part of the sort of cultural reconstruction that's going on in Cambodia of the National Museum system. And this is a very important contribution that this institution has made to Cambodia's reconstruction of its museum sector. And I think Julian Raby and the team need to be congratulated for that. And we should all be aware that this exhibition is a reciprocation. It's a thank you gesture from the government of Cambodia to the Free Sackler and the Getty for their contribution to the reconstruction of museums and museum conservation in Cambodia itself after its lost years. Today I want to essentially report on a research project that I've had running since around 2005, some of which then found its way into the essay I contributed to the catalogue. But I want to provide a little of the background and a sense of where how this work came about, and where it's taken my thinking on the nature of ornamentation of monuments in Angkor. My starting point for this presentation is the assumption that the monuments that we see today are bereft of all of their ornamentation. They're bereft of both stucco decoration, but more importantly of gilded bronze or gilded copper antefixes, appendages, ornaments on the physical structures of these stone monuments, just as we know that ceramic ornamentation was an important part of timber buildings. There's evidence, I think, which has been in large part overlooked, although it's always been there for other people to see and study, which suggests that these monuments were indeed golden monuments, as 13th and 16th century travellers have observed. This little study began at Wat Rajabo, which is I think the third most senior monastery in Cambodia, and a monastery in the heart of Siem Reap. It's dominated by these 19th century structures, which were a legacy of dare I say, Thai colonialism. In the late 19th century, Siem Reap and Battambang provinces were colonized by the Thais under Chulalongkorn, and this particular chapel was built by the Thai governor of Siem Reap province. It has beautiful Thai murals inside, classic 19th century style mural painting. And the monastery itself continues to this day to have a very active involvement in cultural matters. The abbot of this monastery, who's now very elderly, has been actively collecting bronze artifacts from the countryside, members of his lay community bringing things to him, and he's assembled what constitutes really a small private museum within the monastery of important ceramic material, some prehistoric, protohistoric material, and a significant quantity of Angkorian period metalwork. And so this constitutes what I've titled my scrap metal project, if you like, looking at these ancient bits of metal, mostly fragmentary, and trying to understand the way in which they may have functioned as complete objects. And I'll take you through this process and see what conclusions come from it. The main sites we'll be dealing with, it's the greater Angkor area. Here we have Angkor Wat, here we have the enclosure wall for Angkor Thom. Within that, the Royal Temple Complex, the Bayon, and a series of other major Jayavarman VII monuments. Down to the southeast is Bakhong and the Rolus area, the first capital once the Khmer rulers moved down from the hilltop site of Phnom Kulen. This is where they first established their capital in the lowland, in the floodplain area near the Tonle Sap Lake. So this is the area we're dealing with. I'll be discussing some of these monuments, the Western Barai, for example. And here is the Eastern Barai. These are the two great lakes that dominate the landscape in great man-made waterworks, which dominate the landscape of Angkor. We'll be looking at Nikpian up here and Prakan, two important monuments built in the reign of Jayavarman VII. Now, when we think of Cambodian bronze work, we think of spectacular bronze imagery, images of Shiva, of Vishnu, principally, and at certain points in the story, Buddhist imagery. We know that nearly all these bronze images would have originally been gilded, mercury gilded. One of the most complete examples that survives to this day is in the Metropolitan Museum, over a meter-high image, unidentified image, probably an image of Shiva, but there really isn't sufficient iconography to be definitive. It has been suggested it might be a deified ruler. Both these explanations are possible at the same time, because there is this synchronistic approach in Cambodian worship, whereby images of a god are often identified closely with the person of the ruler. The kings would take a form of honorific title which incorporated the name of the god they worshipped, and so you get this fusing together of image of gods and, if you like, semi-deified rulers. So we could be looking at an image which embodies both elements. Large-scale bronze casting, and you'll see some others which are spectacularly large to give a sense of the achievement of bronze casters in the Angkorian period. They really were the master casters of bronze casters of Southeast Asia, only rivaled, I might say, by the bronze casting tradition of the Cholas in South India, the 10th through 12th centuries, the peak period for the bronze casters of southern India, and this is precisely the time frame when some of the greatest bronzes were also being cast in Cambodia, and nowhere else in Southeast Asia were they cast on this scale, or indeed this technical quality that we see in some of these pieces I'll present today. We also know they worked in precious metals. The inscriptions tell us this. They speak of golden and silver images, and they don't simply mean, I think, gilded images. They mean golden images. They mean solid gold images. All gone, of course. Precious metal objects, the first adverse turn of events, these get melted down. They don't survive as a rule. There are very rare instances of precious metal images surviving, but very, very rare. One is this image on the right, an extraordinarily beautiful image of the head of what would have been a life-size image of Vishnu. The farmers who found this in Champasak district in southern Laos, on the border of Cambodia, but historically Khmer territory. This is the area of Wat Phu and Champasak on the Mekong River. This was found by local farmers who promptly attempted to divide the spoils, hence you get the axe marks, as they attempted to cut what they thought was a solid silver image. They found it was a sheet silver over a wooden core, and desisted from cutting it in two. It found its way into the collection of the Prince of Champasak some years before the Lao Revolution. Present whereabouts unknown. Now we then have a whole series of remarkable images which relate to monuments, and I wanted to quickly just look at some of the commentaries. The epigraphic literary records for Southeast Asia are exceedingly sparse, certainly compared to China, which is uniquely endowed with dare one say, obsessed with writing its own history. This is a particular feature of Chinese culture. India is rather less well endowed with written records. So in South India, we have quite extensive inscriptions that record donations of images. So we often can't link them to particular specific objects, but we have a real sense of the important role of commissioning of images for temple use. In Cambodia itself, the epigraphic record is quite extensive. There are virtually no inscribed images, and there are one or two notable exceptions. One of them are dated images in this exhibition, but that's exceedingly rare. Principally, the inscriptions appear not on the object itself, but on the monument in which it was installed, either on a freestanding stele or carved into the door jambs of the monument, most typically. So, of course, they get separated, and then re-establishing the bond between the object and the site which it was dedicated is often problematic, to say the least. But we do have some contemporary observations, and of course the most famous one that many of you will be aware of if you have an interest in Cambodia is the very famous late 13th century descriptions of life at Angkor by a member of a Chinese mission, a Yuan dynasty diplomatic trade mission from the 1280s. Zhou Dequan, a middle rank diplomat, spent just over a year living at Angkor at the close of the Angkorian period, but still in its heyday, if you like, at the last twilight years of the kingdom. And he provides really quite vivid descriptions of a number of monuments. And he refers repeatedly to the presence of what he calls golden towers and the presence of monumental golden images, or gilded or golded images of gods and of animals, so typically the protective animals, lions, or the vehicles on which the gods ride, so vahanas, Nandi, and so on. And he makes specific reference to one site. He mentions a certain distance, a couple of kilometers north of Angkor Thom, refers to a lake shrine complex, which is almost certainly Nikpian, a very important lake shrine. It's a single tower structure in a circular lake form, linked through the water systems directly to Prakan, which was Jayavarman VII's personal temple, if you like. And the shrine itself dedicated to the Bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara, as the Lord of embodiment of Buddhist compassion. We have his description of this site. He says that the northern lake, which we think is the site of Nikpian, 1¼ miles north of the walled city, at the center a square tower of gold, several dozen stone rooms. If you're looking for golden lions, bronze elephants, bronze oxen, bronze horses, here is where you will find them. So put X on the map, and this is where the golden images are. And this has become important a couple of centuries later when there's extensive looting at Angkor, and we know that many of these objects were then taken outside the country. This is the image of Lokeshvara, Avalokiteshvara, on the main tower of the Nikpian tower in the circular lake. It was originally a multi-armed bodhisattva image. After the collapse, the end of Jayavarman VII's reign and the end of Mahayana Buddhism being the favored religion of the state at that time, reversion back to Hinduism, this image was converted into an image of Shiva. Now, what's remarkable is the number of monumental images that have come down to us in Cambodia, and they still continue to be found. There's a very significant bronze linga, which I'll come to in a moment, that was only found last year, and it has been in the Sackler Getty conservation laboratory, shall we call it, being conserved over this last year, and about to go on display at the National Museum. This image, this extraordinary life-size, I might stress, Silver Nandi, quite extraordinary object, discovered in 1983 at a temple site in Kandal province, southern site east of Phnom Da, pre-Angkorian site down towards the Vietnamese modern-day Vietnamese border. An object then brought to the capital, installed in the Silver Pagoda, which is the royal chapel for the royal family, the temple attached to the royal palace complex in Phnom Penh. And this, of course, this image fits beautifully with our 13th century Chinese description of the images being produced in the Angkorian, late Angkorian period. Now we have other visual evidence which can give us a sense of what worship practices must have been like in Angkorian Cambodia. The Bayon is a monument which has a long history of construction, a whole series of very extensive narrative relief panels which tell sort of episodic scenes from Cambodian history, not all produced at the same time. There are a whole series of workings of the Bayon site, and some of the reliefs are rather later than the initial period of construction of the site. Nonetheless, they're a window, if you like, onto life at Angkor. They show many scenes of daily life. They show a lot of scenes of military activity, the encampment of soldiers, the movement of armies, and they show images like this, where we have an enshrined monumental image of Vishnu, not clear whether it's a stone or precious metal image, in its own little sanctuary, and then what we reasonably assume would be royal worshippers. This crowned figure here performing prostration here, and it's presumably a king, and then his queens in attendance, and we have all the regalia of royalty, of course, the umbrellas and standards which indicate we're in a royal presence here. So there's no question that this is, in fact, royal worship of Vishnu, almost certainly in the 13th century. This is post-Jayavarman VII, and the carving is a little crude compared to some of the reliefs on the Bayon, but the content is certainly very, very revealing. We can get a glimpse of what it must have been like in Hollywood Technicolor in 2001, when I made, I think, my second trip not my second trip to Cambodia, my second trip to Bante Shrey. I stumbled upon this taking place in the grounds of the temple, which I think is probably not permitted now. And I inquired, and I was told that this was an expatriate Khmer family who had escaped from Cambodia during the dark years, had gone abroad, had prospered, and had come back and had commissioned a priest, shall we call him, to perform essentially a Thanksgiving service to the ancestors. And so these offerings are being prepared and being very elaborate, private act of worship is being performed within the grounds of Bante Shrey, giving, I think, a real sense of what ritual life in the temples may well have been like back in the Angkorian period. It was a very surprising little window on ritual practice and opening up a sense of what it must have been like in the past. Now, there are sort of other aspects to worship in Cambodia about which we know very, very little. Some years ago, I was working on the sculptural and ritual arts of Champa, of central Vietnam, as a kingdom which is very, very ancient, well, a series of little kingdoms, really, scattered along the Vietnamese coast, very indeterminate histories. And the Champa kingdoms, if you like, were the easternmost point at which Hindu-Buddhist culture extended. That really is the frontier, if you like, with the Sino world, the Sino-Dai-Viet world of northern Vietnam, as far east as Indic culture penetrated. And in Champa, there's an enormous amount of attention paid to the worshipping of Shiva in his linga form, and we get a unique series of images which almost don't survive in the Indian context, although they have Indian origins, of course, and this can be proven. But we have far more examples of these linga covers, linga kosha, with the endorsed face of Shiva coming from Champa than we do from India. And so my question was, where are these in Cambodia? So I went and sat at the feet of Professor Claude Jacques at the Sorbonne and said, tell me, who is the great authority on Khmer inscriptions, the successor to Georges Sudès, the great pioneer of Khmer epigraphy. I said, tell me, what do the Khmer inscriptions tell us about linga kosha? He said, nothing. I mean, I think there was one or possibly two references out of 1,200, passing references out of 1,200 inscriptions. So it's almost non-existent. And this is very sort of strange and curious, because they should be there. But the inscriptions were not telling us that. But maybe they were just taken for granted. This is part of the regalia, part of the paraphernalia of ritual. But we had all these extraordinary, beautiful silver and gilt images from Vietnam at the same time frame. And then last year, Paul Jett was back and forth to Cambodia, getting this exhibition together, and sent me photographs of a recently discovered bronze linga cover, just come out of the ground, with a long inscription around the base of the linga in bronze. And he just demonstrated for me a short time ago. It's of that scale, and in a sense our first tangible evidence that this practice was going on in Cambodia as we know it should have been, but we didn't have the archaeological evidence. So this is an important new sort of development in Cambodian archaeology, and I think over time, more and more new material is going to come forth. The French, bless them, who spent 100 years studying Khmer culture, were quite rightly preoccupied with monuments and with inscriptions, and these very correctly took all their attention. There was almost no digging in the ground, almost no dirt archaeology undertaken. It was just beginning to happen under Bernard Philippe Grolier, when things started to fall apart, and it's only just resumed in recent years in a small way. But there's vast amounts of archaeology waiting to be done in Cambodia, and that will be a whole new exciting chapter for the next generation of Cambodians to explore. But returning to our topic, the great bronze casting traditions that we know about, described by Joe de Quan and others, are epitomized in the greatest single image. And any of you have been to the National Museum in Phnom Penh, you will know this image, or indeed you were exceedingly privileged for it to come to the National Gallery exhibition in Washington back in whenever, a decade ago, I guess. The great image of the reclining Vishnu, monumental, the largest image largest bronze image recorded anywhere in Southeast Asia. A most extraordinary object. In its complete form would have been approaching 6 meters in length. So we're talking something like 18, 20 feet. I mean, this is a monumental bronze, cast in sections, riveted together, but quite extraordinary. And a clear demonstration of the skills of the bronze casters operating within the royal circles at Angkor. Now, it's very interesting that the Joe de Quan, in his 13th century commentary, actually makes reference to what he calls a reclining Buddha in one of the barais. He refers to the Eastern Barai as having a reclining Buddha. The Eastern Barai has 2 very important step pyramid temples, nothing that would could possibly resemble what he describes, and it would seem that his description was mistaken. This is indeed a reclining figure, but not a Buddha, but being not versed in Hinduism, he wouldn't have necessarily known the difference, and I think his description is in fact referring to what he would have heard about through hearsay only, most likely, that there was this great reclining bronze image in the Western Barai on a small man-made island, which is a small temple, but not accessible. This site would not have been open to the public or indeed to foreigners. You couldn't get on a little tourist boat as you can today and go out to the Western Barai Island and and poke around and see where this was recovered. This site would have been restricted to the king, his entourage, and his senior priests who would perform the state rituals that had such efficacy in securing the good fortune of his kingdom, appeasing the gods and so on. So this was a place of private worship, and this bronze would have been seen, I think, by very few. But it is quite spectacular, is unique in the history of Southeast Asian bronze casting, one of the greatest testimonies to the skill of the Cambodian bronze casters. As you can see, it would have been extensively inlaid. Recesses here in the eyebrows, the eyes, and the moustache, which would have taken precious metal inlay of various types, probably either glass or rock crystal in the eyes, and then silver, and probably for the eyebrows, probably gold for the lower lip, if we're following the practices of other Indic cultures. Now, to give you a sense of what this entire image was like, various other fragments of the piece have been recovered, not really sufficient to reassemble it, but you get a real sense of what it is. You also can see how the different sections were cast independently for assembly. That's quite an extraordinary document, and this archival photograph from the French records gives a real sense of how this great bronze was cast in sections and reassembled, no doubt, on site. Now, the other thing to be aware of is that although spectacular as the great reclining Vishnu is, it is just the most impressive of a whole lineage of great bronzes being produced in the late Angkorian period. And we have another set of images which have a particularly fascinating story attached to them, and we've I think I'm on reasonably safe grounds in linking these surviving bronzes that we have, these late Angkorian bronzes from the late 12th or early 13th century bronzes, I think produced after the Cham raids at Angkor, which the city was devastated and looted, and Jayavarman VII rose to power in restoring Khmer authority after those raids. So I think these could not have survived those raids. They almost certainly have been produced after that date, and then some date before the collapse of the Khmer kingdom at the early 13th century. So we have a sort of window in which these would have been produced. These objects survive in a small monastery in Mandalay in Upper Burma. And it is a remarkable historical story that these have traveled so extensively over the centuries. And they can be linked, I believe, to some descriptions that appear in the royal chronicles of Ayodhya, the official Thai history from the 15th, 16th century. These histories have been rewritten in later periods, and so the historical efficacy is problematic. But embedded in these stories is a lot of historical factual information. And the Ayodhya chronicles expressly tell us that in 1431, the armies of the Thai king, Boramatracha II, seized Nakhon Luang, which is the Thai name for Angkor. And let me just read you the translation produced by Cushman and David Wyatt in this very important document. So in this year, 783, the year of the ox, the Thai king seized Angkor, appointed his son on the throne. He also then took various named members of the Khmer royal family, as no doubt as royal hostages, together with images of sacred oxen and images of all the lions and other creatures, took them back to Ayodhya. And these images were offered up and installed at Sri Ratna Mahatat Monastery and Prasri Panhet Monastery. These are the two most important temples in Ayodhya, royal temples in Ayodhya. So we have clear suggestion of this looting of these Cambodian images and their installation in the monasteries of Ayodhya. The sequel to this story is that, of course, and many of you will know this, that Ayodhya was then sacked by the Burmese, or repeatedly attacked by the Burmese, and finally sacked and looted in the 18th century. The objects then went to Pegu in Lower Burma. In turn, they found their way to Arakan and then to Mandalay. So they have a long and extraordinary history. And it's revealing at no point in their history were these objects actually melted down for their metal value. They were clearly seen as powerful tokens of authority. To be both respected and to possess them was to imbibe you with some of that authority. So conquering rulers wanted to possess them. They didn't want to simply turn them into base metal. And then, just to show you some of the detailing, they're quite extraordinary, beautifully modelled, but had extensive inlay. You can see all the settings for precious stones and so on in these highly decorated images. And then we have a related example now in the Metropolitan Museum here. Now, there are a whole series of other monumental bronzes coming from sites in northeast Thailand, two of which, they're fragmentary pieces that survive, but they're approximately double life-size images of bodhisattvas. So these are spectacular pieces. The head of one is now in the National Museum. Another substantial figure is in the museum in Pimai, coming from sites in the former Khmer territories in the north, across the Damrak Mountains in the Isan. So very extensive production of large-scale images across the Cambodian Empire in this time frame. There's another of the so-called Arakan bronzes, image of Erwan, the vehicle, the multi-headed elephant, the vehicle of Indra, which is undoubtedly of Cambodian origin, found its way to Burma. And finally, a shot of again, these guardians, and in the foreground, one of the imperial lions from Angkor. The head is a replacement. The head is a Burmese replacement, but the figure itself would seem almost certainly be original Cambodian Angkorian period. And I'll just show you some comparable lion figures from the royal bathing place at Tra Shrang at Angkor. Now, to this very well-established tradition of making these spectacular bronzes, we also have a parallel tradition in Cambodia of making much smaller objects for ritual enactment. And this again follows Indian custom, Indian religious practice, bells, vajras, various lamps, incense burners, objects which would be used for the performance of pujas and other religious ceremonies. And I'll just show you a range of these types of objects which are recorded from Angkorian sites. Here we have the bells, which can be used in both a Hindu and a Buddhist context. They're not exclusive. People tend to think of them as objects for use in Mahayana, Vajrayana Buddhism, the bell and the thunderbolt scepter, but they also, particularly the bell, can be used in the Hindu context. Here you have the Vajra handle feature. Again, a single Vajra here, thunderbolt scepter, and imitation of a conch shell, here in a bronze version. And I'll come back to the subject matter on this conch shell in a moment, bronze shell. Rather an important image. Conch shells in India have a very ancient history. They're referred to in the Mahabharata and the other great epic literature. They're used as war trumpets, but they're also used in ritual. The sound emitted from blowing a conch shell is seen as a primordial sound to do with the origins of life itself, the seed syllable, and they're then used in India always only using the actual shell itself. In Cambodia, we have this curious custom of making imitations in ceramic, almost certainly in precious metals, that we don't have any surviving, and cast in bronze. And nearly all the bronze examples have a very distinctive decorative program. They all tend to show images of Hevajra. Now, Hevajra is an expression of the Hevajra Tantra cult. It's a Vajrayana Buddhist text in the late first millennium, Eastern India, very, very important for tantric ritual, which we know spread through Indonesia, Champa, and Cambodia in the course of the 10th, 11th centuries. Tisha, the great Tibetan teacher, instrumental in the second transmission of Buddhism to Tibet, spent time in Srivijaya, the great mercantile center of Sumatra, teaching, we assume, doing I guess a visiting professorship, you might say, at the great monastery at Srivijaya, the Mahavihara, and that monastery, and these were really the universities of their day. These were the University of Padua, the University of Paris, of medieval India and Southeast Asia. So Atisha is teaching in Srivijaya and then returns to India and finds his way to Tibet. He was one of the principal exponents of his generation of the Hivajra Tantra, which was newly being introduced into ritual practice in Vajrayana circles, spinning out of the teachings, the advanced Buddhist teachings going on in the great monastic universities in Bihar and Bengal. So these ideas are circulating in Southeast Asia very quickly, and indeed the teachers and exponents of these new doctrines were also traveling in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia was in no sense a backwater. It was no sense getting hand-me-down culture from India. It was really sharing in the whole process of an evolving culture. It's interesting to reflect that the most extensive Sanskrit inscription that has come down to us as a stele, as opposed to a written document, the most extensive carved Sanskrit inscription that survives is not in India, it's actually in Cambodia. And the practice of carving inscriptions into monuments, of recording dedications and donations, which begins in India, really at the very end of the Gupta period and beyond, when we get this monumental temple building programs taking off. Again, this happens in Cambodia in a very similar time frame. We have inscriptions in Southeast Asia in Sanskrit and already from the 5th and 6th centuries. So really parallel developments going on here. And it's interesting that this, the conch shell that's in the exhibition, not the one on the screen, has been was recovered in the royal the enclosure of the royal palace complex at Angkor Thom, and can be, I think, almost certainly linked to tantric ritual practices taking place. It certainly tends to imply that tantric ritual practices were taking place within the royal palace complex itself, which directly suggests that there were royal supporters of tantrism within the Khmer court of this time. And a recent inscription on one of the conchs in the National Museum, which is dated to 1196, has this direct link with royal patronage. Now, there are a range of other sort of bronze images. There are a whole series of little warrior figures. You see them here. These are, in fact, battle standard figures. A few survive in bronze. They're quite rare. And this is extraordinary battle scene taking place. It's a relief at the Bakong down at Rolas. And you see the little battle standard broken off its mast here, falling down, and another one here. These are sort of very powerful little sort of images. There's an extraordinary sword guard, gilt bronze sword guard in the V&A collection, which is just embedded with a lion and elephant imagery, little warrior figures and so on. Quite extraordinary piece of military equipment. Now, I want to sort of move the focus to the monuments themselves. We have an interesting description that was published in 1603 when the Portuguese started poking around Angkor. There were a whole series of visitors in the course of the 16th and late second half of the 16th century, principally. The Japanese were there. Of course, the large communities of Japanese were based at Hoi An in central Vietnam. They're also based at Ayutthaya, both as merchant communities, and we know a little later that there were Japanese mercenaries serving at the Thai court at Ayutthaya as the royal guard under one of the great 17th century Thai kings. So Japanese travelers found their way to Angkor, and the Portuguese also went there. Using the river systems, most probably the land travel would have been very problematic, but going up through the Mekong and then into the river systems, linking up to the Great Lake at Angkor in the right season is not so difficult. So this is the way in which we think the travelers accessed Angkor. And the Portuguese provide descriptions, again, of the monuments themselves, which, of course, were assumed to have been abandoned by this point, but the descriptions say that they may have been not so much abandoned as perhaps just functioning at a more modest level, but still supporting communities of monks and so on, and still with their gilded copper ornaments in place. And they refer to golden copper balls and sort of arrows and spearhead type shapes appearing on these towers. So in the late 16th century, there were certainly these ornaments still to be seen in a way that they were not to be seen today. Many of the monuments, including some of the great gateways, if one looks closely at them and climbs up onto the walls and gets a little closer, you start to see very extensive use of drilled holes in the decorations. Now we know in the basic technology of temple building in Cambodia, to move your big building blocks of stone after they're shaped in the quarry, you drill a series of holes into which you could put wooden fixings and then tie ropes, and that's how you then move your stones and drag them along on rollers onto your pontoons and float them on the canal system to your site, often man-made canals connecting existing river systems. That's how we think most of the stone moved around. So the quarries are significant distances often from the monuments, and they could not have moved all that stone over land, so they must have used water. So some of these holes are certainly for that purpose, but there are a lot of other holes that don't seem surplus to that requirement, and it may be that these were for fixings of metal cladding of some sort, and certainly the descriptions suggest that these golden faces and golden towers are referred to. So it's not impossible that these were decorated, as indeed were some of the wall decorations as well. We have descriptions from Prakan of extensive amounts of metal being used on the enclosure walls, again probably for capping and finial decoration. Some of the evidence for this, some of it can be taken from these exquisite line drawings produced in the 1920s by Parmentier, one of the great early founding members of the French school in Cambodia, the EFEO. And he produced these conjectural drawings, but based on very detailed study and observation of real monuments, and then reconstructed, if you like, graphically what he imagined these structures looked like, and took elements from modern-day monuments as well and tried to translate them into a historic context. So they are conjectural, but nonetheless you will see a very extensive use of decorative elements, many of which relate directly to some of the ornaments that we've been finding in Cambodia in recent years. Timber structures we know would have had either wooden roof decoration or, in many cases, ceramic decoration, and there's extensive finds. Most of the monuments at Angkor, most of the single towers that you'll see scattered around the landscape are incomplete now because they would have had veranda extensions in timber. And if you look around the foundations of these monuments, you'll very quickly notice you're walking on a sea of broken roof tiles, because these verandas all then had ceramic tile roofs. All of that has just collapsed into the landscape. But any sort of investigation immediately around the monument, you'll see very extensive ceramic evidence for these extensions, these veranda extensions in timber, which would have completed the structures. But then we also have rare but compelling evidence in terms of bronze examples. This beautiful bronze finial with this clear sort of molded roof ridge type finial detailing here. Angkorian, clearly in my mind intended for architectural decoration, and substantial. This is 6 or 8 inches in height, and a rare example, but compelling evidence, I think, that the buildings themselves, the stone buildings, then had these metal ornaments affixed to them. We know that there are also particular widespread use of the trident. This is Shiva's sacred weapon, the Trishula, three-part weapon, would have been on a high standard and carried by guardians, sometimes carried by followers of Shiva, and occasionally by Shiva himself. We have other images. This is almost certainly an image of Shiva riding Nandi, which is quite a popular image in Cambodia, one which almost never appears in early Indian art, but except in some later paintings. But this is probably the subject matter represented here. Now, if you look at some of the monuments from the 12th century, we're back at the Bakong, which is basically a 9th century monument, but then it has these superstructures which were built in a later phase of renovation. And on the towers itself, we find replication of the form of these same buildings. So here we have the same tower form, the prasad structure here, with lots of ornamental detail with the Naga finials here, flame-like elements decorating the archway above the deity, and on the very roof, or the very peak of the tower, a three-part trident, symbol of Shiva. Probably a very good lightning conductor, I imagine, as well. But basically, Shiva's symbol. And above that, another curious form, sort of sawtooth form, which I'll come back to in a minute. So here we have some of the Trishulas, the Shiva's symbol. Again, these are well documented. One was found at the base of the royal chapel in the royal temple enclosure at Angkor Thom, at the very base of the staircase. Another was found in the moat at Preah Khan. So they have good provenance, and they've clearly simply toppled down from the nearby monuments and then survived in the buried nearby. We have other images out at Rolos, this extraordinary image of this guardian figure holding a trident here, Dwarapala, a door guardian, follower of Shiva, and a small bronze of the same subject. So the trident is very extensively used in Shiva imagery at Angkor. These are reliefs on pillars, again showing guardians. And we have a few rare instances where small-scale tridents, more or less about that scale, human scale, have survived as well. And then I show you a very interesting small relief detail in which we see a priest, a Hindu rishi with the long uncut hair piled up here, again holding the Trishula. Get a real sense of the scale of these objects, and this can be taken as a reasonably sensible, realistic rendering. And from our scrap metal collection at the monastery in Siem Reap, we have examples of these, fragments like this in bronze, the larger sections with an iron core, with bronze cast over the iron core, the smaller ones just pure bronze. With quite remarkable fragments of these ornaments. Now, there's one particular the monument, that of Preah Khan, which I've mentioned a couple of times already, which is very, very important in this story because the inscription at Preah Khan, which is an inscription of Jayavarman VII, the most famous, J7, as to those in the field, he's very the great patron of Mahayana Buddhism, broke tradition with his predecessors and became a devout Buddhist. Lasted for a generation, but he was a megalomaniac in terms of building both temples, vast numbers of temples built within the kingdom, vast numbers of hospitals built, rest houses, all contributions to the spiritual and physical welfare of his people, but probably exhausted the kingdom through his sort of building programs. At Preah Khan, there's a long inscription which talks about the inner sanctuary of the Preah Khan temple being golden. Now, no one quite knew what this meant, and this is the space that's being described was thought to be being described in the inscription. It has this post-Angkorian stupa, which has been installed, so that's a later addition. We can ignore that. And I took the trouble to look at these quite closely, all these drilled holes and so on, which everyone assumed was to take metal cladding. Well, those that thought about it, possibly for metal cladding, and there's absolutely no evidence of that whatsoever. What is clear that many of these still have wooden pegs embedded in plaster, in stucco, in these holes. And this is a practice we've seen elsewhere at Angkor. At many of the monuments, including the great temple complex in the eastern Mebon, where the surfaces are extensively drilled, they would have then had wooden pegs inserted, but allowed to project. And these then provide the supports to hold the render of plaster. So basically to stop it slipping away from the surface. So this would have been plaster covered and painted, would be my explanation. But it still leaves the question of where's this golden room at Prakan? This is a very important space in the ritual life of this royal temple, dedicated in 1191. And when you step outside into the next room, which would not have been open as it is today, would have been a closed space, you see something which is very surprising, which hasn't really been noted that I'm aware of before. The first thing you notice is all the pillars are really rather crudely cut, not finished. This is the stage before finishing. You see all the chisel marks are still very visible, and we have these extensive holes. Again, many more holes than you would need to physically move the bits of stone around with wooden poles and ropes and so on. And if you look closely, what do you see? You see iron staining, extensive iron staining in the holes. In some cases, fragments of iron pins or nails driven into the drilled holes in the stone. And in some cases, the residual remains of copper or bronze, but some sort of copper oxide remaining here on the bronze, on the iron pin itself. And I think what iron pins driven into these holes. And so this is probably the room to which the royal inscription refers, and I think gives us, we have to rethink how that whole space, the ritual space within that temple functioned. So I think this is our evidence, and this has always been there, but not been noted. And I think it gives us an explanation of what I want to show you now in conclusion, which is to take you through a range of the scrap metal objects, not visually so exciting perhaps as what you've seen already, but nonetheless clear evidence that there was extensive cladding of the stone surfaces with bronze, ornamental bronze sheeting, plaques of bronze with raised relief decoration, which were then fixed onto the stone surfaces. And this is a very surprising addition to what we understand when we see the Angkorian monuments. Now, let me just show you some examples. This is the hall, the dancing hall, adjacent to where these pillars are. And these may well have been linked to very important royal cults. So this is a great Hevajra image you'll see in the exhibition here this afternoon, the most beautiful Hevajra miniature shrines. And this particular example, again, is recorded as having been excavated within the royal enclosure at Angkor Thom, but we have other evidence that Prakan, for example, may well have had also Hevajra cult activity taking place. We have this extensive program of dancing figures, which are always described as apsaras, but may well be dakinis, may well be the celestial expressions of Hevajra. Now, I show on the left, here's a little dakini figure, and on the right, on the left is one of the scrap metal pieces, a very exciting fragment. If I show you a close-up detail, it's a flat ornament, flat sheet decoration, relief, and you can clearly see it's the upper section, upper torso of a woman. This is the necklace, the upper armband. Her arm then twists around some vine form. So she's clearly a dancing figure, and as a relief decoration. And there's no other place these relief decorations could have been used except cladding monuments. We have some other examples. This is an example of open work relief work, very, very rare in the Victorian Albert Museum collection. almost certainly from a Buddhist context, with this celestial worshipper emerging from a lotus. This is a classic motif in both Khmer and Thai culture. This is the Tapanan, if you know your Thai imagery, adoring figure, lotus-born figure, a celestial devotee. The decoration is directly coming out of this tradition. This is some of these lintels on the eastern Merbon, which are arguably some of the greatest stone carving in all of Angkor, is embodied in these lintel decorations, beautifully deep cut, highly imaginative relief decorative programs. To show you some of the line drawings which provide context for this fragment. We don't know how this fragment functioned. It could have been clearly part of a larger ensemble and part of the decoration, probably of a large nimbus surrounding an enthroned image. It has an inscription, two-part inscription. One part refers to a word relating to the deity, and the other seems to relate to a vihara, a Buddhist monastery. So it's presumed, we've had both Professor Claude Jacques and Professor Michael Vickery, who are the two most eminent scholars of Khmer epigraphy, attempt to read these inscriptions. They're very incomplete and very ambiguous. They essentially, I suspect, builder's instructions on the back of the object on how these bits of the jigsaw were to be used. Now, returning to the great tower on the Bakong, I mentioned this decorative detail, which is enigmatic. We don't really know what this is architecturally, but then we have fragments like this in the bronze collection, which give us a clue. This has no particular function one can think of except architectural ornament. This is a base view where it be slotted onto a support, probably an iron pin, and this is a fragment of this kind of decoration. So it appears to be a roof decoration element from one of the Angkorian monuments. This is the only example we know, so we're not on very firm ground, but this is a reasonable conjectural explanation of how this functioned. Other fragments, you recognize this is a naga coming out of this foliate detail here. This is the snake's head, little projection there. Again, this has an extensive inscription, which the French are working on translating at the moment. We have other decorations which directly mimic stucco and plasterwork from the Angkorian sites. And I just want to show you a whole range of these metal fragments, how they relate to ornaments. The head of a Garuda, here's a more complete version of the same subject in a Thai ceramic from the 15th century. This is the Angkorian version, if you like, from around the 12th century. Again, fragments of this mythical dragon face, the Kurtimuka, which we see here and repeated in this fragment here. And other ornaments, I've just provided some parallels for these designs. But all of these fragments clearly had some function in terms of the temple context. There's not a ritual function, it seems to purely have been an architectural one. Or some, in fact, may have been used to ornament carriages, palanquins, that sort of thing as well. Here you've clearly got an architectural element, a little lug here for fixing this railing. Again, we have ceramic versions of these. And very interesting, this corner fragment here with original bronze rivets still in position. A very important iron, bonding iron. This is to hold together the building stones. It's a locking mechanism so the stones don't separate. And we have a few examples of these surviving from the Angkorian period. And here's one of the bronze rivets. Not a very exciting object, but interesting in terms of this sort of thesis advancing this afternoon, and an architect's plummet, Angkorian period, the tools of architecture. And just a range of these architectural details, small fragments. Recasting here, this is the back view, and the recasting and reworking of scrap metal into consolidating a probably miscast piece. And then we have these extraordinary things like this beautiful lotus finial, which is in the exhibition. Again, its function is not at all clear. There's conjectural suggestion in the catalogue, but can't really offer a definitive explanation, but one can certainly find close parallels in the great reliefs of the Apsaras at Angkor Wat, for example. Very beautiful pendants, as seen being worn here. This large claw setting, these typically would have had rock crystal as set into them. And just a couple of images of donor figures. This whole process of commissioning all of these images, we know from the inscriptions, was largely royal-driven. The royal families were directly involved in most of the temple building and in most of the patronage for the imagery that went along with them, and for the endowment of the temples for their maintenance in perpetuity. The granting of slaves, the granting of land, rice field revenue, which were assigned to particular temples to give them the wealth to maintain the priestly population and to burn the eternal lamps, etc., etc. Even the inscriptions even describe funds set aside to buy the oil to service the lamps in the sanctuaries. And the information is very, very precise. Now, I wanted to conclude back at Wat Rajabo, where we began, where they're building a new extension within the monastery compound, a new structure, which will be both a meeting hall and will have a little museum where many of these objects will be housed. And I was fascinated on a couple of return visits to see the monks very busily engaged in preparing some of the architectural ornamentation for this new structure. It's a 3-story cast reinforced concrete structure, which will then have various bits of decorations added to its pediments and awnings and so on. And I thought it gives us a little glimpse on perhaps what it might have been like in the past. We have the monks actively engaged in the production of ornamentation for their own monasteries. And here they are busily engaged in producing these very beautiful clay images and working up the detailing both in clay and in cast concrete, which will then be part of the temple decoration. And the quality of the work, as you can see, is quite remarkable. This is new work. It's almost certainly now in situ, though I've not been back for a little while, so I've not seen the final result. But this will be fixed to the structure and form part of the modern-day decorative program of these monuments, just as the bronzes we've been looking at this afternoon represented the decoration of these monuments in the Angkorian period. Thank you.